Hi everyone, my name is teacher Paulina, and today we're going to solve some questions from the hard module of the reading and writing sections that students encountered on the previous SAT exams. So let's begin with this first one. The following text is adapted from Guy de Maupassant's 1884 story, a recollection from the collection of stories. The narrator taking a boat down the Seine River, Paris, France, to the surrounding countryside. So my advice for you in this type of questions, it's a literature question, не стоит прочитывать полностью все имена, все названия, потому что это может занять ваше время. Даже несмотря на это не даст вам никакой информации. Но обязательно нужно прочитать this little excerpt, то есть параграф перед самим произведением, если особенно это что-то литературное. So, I took up a position in the bows, standing up and looking at the quays, the trees, the houses, and the bridges disappearing behind us, and suddenly I perceived the great viaduct of Point de Jour, which blocked the river. It was the end of Paris, the beginning of the country, and behind the double row of arches in the Seine, suddenly spreading out as though it had regained space and liberty, became all at once the peaceful river which flows through the plains alongside the wooded hills, amid the meadows along the edge of the forests. So what is happening? The character is taking a boat, and he's leaving Paris. То есть он выходит из-за черты города. So it was the end of Paris, the beginning of the countryside. And behind the double row of arches, the Seine, suddenly spreading out. То есть после того, как он вышел за границу города, река поменялась. What happened here? So suddenly spreading out, as though it had regained space and liberty. So it spread out, regained space and liberty, became all at once peaceful river that flows through the plains alongside the hills and etc. etc. So while the river was still in the borders of the city, то есть в то время, когда река была еще в черте города, it was different from when it was in the countryside. So the countryside is different from the city. So let's mark it somewhere. So countryside river is, let's highlight it, different from the city river. And how it is different. In the countryside, it's peaceful, it's free, it's spreading out as far as it can. So, which choice best expresses the narrator's characterization of the Seine? Answer A says, as the journey progressed from Paris to the countryside, the waters of the Seine gradually cleared. So, gradually cleared. That comes to say if the water of the Seine were dirty, but it doesn't say nothing about how clear the waters were in the text. So, у нас нет информации о чистоте реки, поэтому the fact that the water is cleared isn't really relevant to the narrator's description. And the choice B says, the Seine is similar to Paris in that it is beautiful and slow to change. So, the river is similar to Paris. Here we don't compare the river to the city, so no city versus river comparison. So we compare the river in the countryside and the river outside of the city. So moving on to choice C, the waters of the Seine are more confined and rough in Paris than they are in the countryside. So we compare the rivers of the Seine, first thing, once in countryside and in Paris. So there is a Paris, the city versus countryside contrast. So first things first, they are confined and rough in Paris. So confined and rough means trapped within the borders of the city, то есть они резкие или заключенные в границах города. While in the countryside, they're different. So they're more confined in the city than they are in the countryside. So that means the opposite. In the countryside, они наоборот свободные, just as it says in the text, they are free and spread out very far. So this matches the most with our description. But choice D says the current under the arches of the Point de Jour contrasts starkly with the otherwise calm flow of the Seine throughout the journey. So there is important note about the other parts of the journey of the character, but we don't really know nothing about this journey forward. То есть здесь не описывается его путь полностью, здесь описывается только часть пути, когда он переходит эту черту города и he enters the countryside. So this answer choice will be incorrect. Just as the answer choice A, because we don't know how clear or unclear the waters were. Now, we don't compare Paris to the river, but we compare river in Paris to the river in the countryside. So this means that it shows the contrast between the river in the city and outside of the city. And that's why this answer choice would be the best. Moving on to the next. Water flowing around an obstruction creates vortices of varying size. By detecting vortices, fish can determine the size and position of the obstruction. Testing by the scientists using models of three head shapes, narrow, intermediate, and wide, showed that the large vortices fish with intermediate head would be better able than the wide-headed fish to distinguish between vortices and general turbulence of the water. So this is the most important part of the text. То есть scientists studied three head shapes, narrow, intermediate, and wide, and showed that for large vortices, fish with intermediate heads would be better able than wide-headed fish to distinguish between vortices and general turbulence in the water. So intermediate-headed fish are better at navigating in the turbulence and between the vortices than wide-headed fish. A second research team has therefore hypothesized, so the hypothesis that in low visibility conditions, intermediate-headed fish will be more likely than wide-headed fish to detect obstructions that create large vortices. So, in a quick summary, we can say that intermediate fish can navigate better than wide-headed fish. So this is the quick summary that we need to understand the truths that would support the second team hypothesis. So we need to find the truths that would correspond and connect the two hypotheses together. So moving on to anti-truths, a study using obstructions that created large vortices in low visibility conditions found that intermediate-headed black sea bass, so intermediate-headed fish, bumped into obstructions just as often as the wide-headed. So this doesn't really match the description because it says that both the intermediate-headed fish and the wide-headed fish are the same. То есть они не делают их сравнение, а говорят, что они ориентируются в пространстве одинаково. So that doesn't match, so it's incorrect. A study using obstructions that created large vortices in low visibility conditions found that the white-headed fish bumped into obstructions more often than intermediate Black Sea bass. So white-headed fish bumped into obstructions more often than intermediate-headed fish. So here we say that white-headed fish was worse in navigating than the intermediate-headed fish, which actually matches our description. То есть здесь говорится, что рыбы с широкой головой терялись или ударялись о препятствия чаще, чем intermediate-headed fish. So this does really match, so we can connect it to the summary. Let's still check other choices. A study using obstructions that created large vortices in low visibility conditions found that some specimens of intermediate-headed blackfish, so only some specimens, bumped into obstructions more often than the other specimens of the same fish did. So here, not only we don't compare it to the others, but we say that they bumped more often, когда у нас summary and hypothesis is different. То есть у нас гипотеза в том, что intermediate-headed fish ориентируются лучше, хотя здесь говорится that they bump more often, so it's incorrect. A study using obstructions that create large vortices in low visibility conditions found that this type of fish, which is a relatively wide head, so it's a wide-headed fish, bumped into more than half of the obstructions. So, okay, we do mention the wide-headed fish, но здесь не говорится про intermediate-headed fish, когда у нас самое главное сравнение это между intermediate fish and white-headed fish. So the answer choice that matches our description the best is the answer choice B. A study using obstruction that created light vortices and low visibility conditions found that the white-headed fish bumped into obstructions more often than intermediate-headed fish. So that is what our text suggesting here. Moving on to our next question. This is actually a very interesting question because you need to really think into it. So, a film study student is researching early 20th century film serials, which consisted of individual episodes of a single long story that was shown weekly in theaters. So, это была одна история, которую разделили на несколько эпизодов. So, individual episodes of a single long story that's shown weekly. The name of the movie is a 1933 serial that over 12 episodes, то есть всего там было 12 эпизодов, kept its audience interested with suspense and drama that are typical of the northern adventure genre. So suspense and drama are typical for this genre. The student, however, claims that ultimately audiences of the time preferred resolution and closure over ongoing tension. So resolution and closure is a quick ending over suspense and drama, maybe. So they didn't like that the story dragged on for so long. They had to go every week to the movie theater to understand the ending of the story. То есть зрители предпочитали быстрый конец, быстрое завершение, сразу раскрытые сюжеты, нежели чем драму, suspense или напряжение, которое продолжалось неделями. So, the 12th episode of Cloud Sea Demounted was the most expensive episode of the series to produce. То есть здесь упоминается стоимость эпизодов, стоимость of production, but it doesn't really tell about it in the text, so there is no information about how costly they were. So this choice is most probably incorrect. The 12th episode of Clancy the Mountain was viewed by more people, so 12th episode viewed by more people than any previous episode in the series. So people liked the 12th episode the most. Maybe that's is what the answer choice is trying to say. So people liked the 12th the last, or the final episode the most. So maybe because the 12th episode provided this closure, то есть это был заключительный эпизод, где раскрылись все сюжетные линии, где полностью показали конец, и им не пришлось смотреть множество частей, которые выходили очень долго неделями. But still, modern cities generally regard the first episode as the best installment of Clancy the Mountains. It doesn't really say which episode was the best in the passage, but it naturally confirms in the choice B that 12th episode was likely the best. But here, we don't really talk about the critic's opinion. So we don't know if the first episode was the best installment of this series, so it's not mentioned in the text, so we cannot choose this under choice. Audiences of the time considered Clancy's Demanded to belong to a genre other than Northern Adventure genre. So, different genre? Different genre? But this answer choice would also be incorrect because suspense and drama in the TV series matches the typical Northern Adventure genre. So it does match this genre, so it cannot belong to any other but this Northern Adventure genre. So naturally, the 12th episode was the most viewed episode because it was the final episode of this show, and people in this time preferred resolution and closure, то есть они предпочитали знать, чем все закончится, чем смотреть, как продолжается напряжение в течение всего шоу. So this would be our correct answer. Moving on to the next question. The Reckoning and Resilience exhibition at Duke University's National Museum of Art in South Carolina is dedicated to the work of 30 North Carolina artists. So there's an exhibition of 30 North Carolina artists, including, here they list their names. And what is the underlying claim here? Although the National Museum has focused the exhibitions entirely on North Carolina artists before, so North Carolina artists again, as it did previously in the photography exhibition across the county lines, the breadth of disciplines in the Reckoning and Resilience sets it apart. So the new exhibition is different. due to the breadth of the disciplines included. So, new exhibition. New exhibition is different. Different due to the breadth of disciplines. The breadth, let's write it the same, of disciplines. So it means that they were more disciplines than on the previous photography exhibition, because maybe the photography exhibition only included the photographs of the North Carolina artist. So здесь наверняка на выставке было что-то больше, чем фотографии, maybe other types of art. So maybe that is what we need to look out for. So other types of art. So let's see what will support the underlined claim. Reckoning and resistance and across the county lines were created to emphasize the works that are not by the National Museum. So does it support the claim? No, the claim doesn't really focus on the museum, so this focus on the museum would be unnecessary. The National Museum has a world-class collection of contemporary art that includes many paintings and sculptures from artists both inside and outside North Carolina. So here is a big emphasis on the inside and outside of North Carolina. So inside and outside. But the text says that the current exhibition features 30 North Carolina artists, and previously, National Museum has focused on exhibitions entirely on North Carolina artists before, and nothing has changed actually. So we don't talk about artists from outside North Carolina at all. So next on the choice says Logan is a painter, Watson is a photographer, and Hayes is a sculptor. So painting, photography, and sculpture, three disciplines related to art. So this might be our answer choice because this directly connects us to the breadth of disciplines mentioned previously in the text. So this shows the examples of these disciplines, but still let's check the answer choice D. Watson is a North Carolina photographer, as were all of the artist features in Across the County Lines. So this answer choice doesn't really make sense in the context of this passage at all, because here we only present one specific person from North Carolina, just as all the other people. So здесь только один пример какого-то из художников с этой выставки. And here we do even give an example of the previous exhibition. То есть здесь упоминается предыдущая выставка, даже не та, про которую говорится в начале. So it's incorrect. So answer choice here would be C, where we say that Logan is a painter, Watson is a photographer, and Hayes is a sculptor, because it gives us an example of the breadth of the disciplines here. То есть этот вариант ответа показывает нам, что на выставке были разные виды искусства и показывает нам пример того, что было на выставке. And our last question for today. Raphael and colleagues studied how members of the Yup'ik indigenous group in Papua New Guinea conceptualized time. The researchers recorded their speakers explaining certain temporal words and phrases such as kalip, a past-oriented expression that translates to a long time ago. So the scientists studied speakers explaining certain temporal words and phrases, like a long time ago, and coded each speaker's manual gestures. So they look at their hands, how they were articulating while speaking when referring to time. То есть ученые изучали то, как разные культуры говорят на своих языках и обращаются к времени. То есть какие жесты они при этом делают при разговоре о времени, когда они обращаются к будущему или к прошлому. Previous research have found a tendency in many cultures to make temporal distinctions using spatial concepts and gestures. So temporal distinctions using spatial concepts and gestures, meaning that во многих культурах было заведено, что есть одни и те же жесты, которые относятся к какому-то определенному времени, particularly along the egocentric axes, relative to one the orientation of the speaker. For instance, English speakers often refer to the front or back axis to describe an event in time. So, for example, we point to the front when we talk about the future and point to the back when we talk about the past. So these are the egocentric axes, то есть основанные на позиции самого говорящего, То есть это жесты, которые относятся к самому говорящему. In anthropology paper, student claims that the tendency toward ego-based conceptualizations of time is universal. If true, what would weaken the student's claim? So what we need to say is that not everyone uses the same gestures. Let's highlight it here. And we're actually going to use the example from the earlier part of the text. So not everyone actually uses the same gestures. So this is what we need to find in the answer choices. So first things first, answer A, some grammatical structures used when talking about time are also used in English. So we don't really talk about grammar. We talk about time and gestures. So grammar here is irrelevant, just as answer choice A. When Yupna speakers who are outdoors use gestures to refer to the future, they point uphill from their current location, regardless of which way they're facing. So regardless of which way the way they're facing. So for English language, that's highlighted here. English language, we point in the front. Let's say front is the future and back for past. And this is all on egocentric accesses. So from the speaker's perspective, here they say, regardless of the location, regardless of which way the person speaking is facing, they point uphill to talk about future. So this is different from the English speakers, right? Answer choice C says, European speakers point in opposite direction when indicating past events versus future events. Okay, but it doesn't really say that they use different gestures. So English is back and front, and Yupna is maybe up or down when talking about future and the past, but this doesn't really show this distinction. This says that yes, the gestures for future and past are different, but we don't really talk about the difference in the gestures themselves. То есть мы не говорим, какая разница в жестах, которые они делают, а в том, что они просто различаются, когда говорим о прошлом или о будущем. And lastly, although Yupno speakers and English speakers both use gestures to indicate orientation in time, Yupno speakers tend to use fewer gestures overall when speaking than English speakers do. So here there is a contrast referring to the number of gestures. So we don't really talk about how many gestures English speakers use versus how many gestures this indigenous culture group uses. So this would most probably be incorrect because we need to talk about the direction of the gestures. So D is incorrect. And the correct choice here would be B. It says that Yupna speakers use gestures when talking about the future that point uphill from their current location, regardless of which way they're facing. So it's not on the egocentric axis, but it's referring to whatever conception of time they have. То есть, вне зависимости от того, куда они смотрят, they will always point uphill, which will show their conception of time. So these are all questions for today. Thank you for staying, and I hope everything was clear. Turn back more for better questions.